Most of us do not think of poverty as a violent act, but poverty is the single largest cause of death in the world. We have been taught that capitalism is equated to freedom, and that capitalism is necessary for development. The world's poor would offer you another perspective. They would show you that capitalism requires that there are winners and losers, and that the losers often have no voice to articulate their political desires. Capitalism is based on the premise that competition is necessary for market forces to work properly, and that individuals act in their own self-interest, regardless of the impacts upon others. While we have been privileged enough to witness the positive effects of the invisible hand at work, we would be remiss if we did not take a moment to evaluate the effects of our actions. At this moment, I would invite you to examine the other side of capitalism and free trade. In the capitalist model, the landowners and capitalists own capital and pay workers the lowest wage possible. The capitalist is then able to gain profits from his or her business, profiting from the workers' labor, while giving the workers no access to those profits. There is no requirement for the capitalist to share his or her profits, and by the very definition of capitalism, he or she has no incentive to do so. Individuals have recognized that a purely free market system is detrimental for all parties. Even so-called free market countries such as the US maintain substantial protection for workers, while still generating and sustaining economic development and growth. Most so-called free market economies have implemented labor reforms such as minimum wages, Social Security, unionization, workers' compensation, and many other protections without sacrificing economic development. My opponents assume that any government regulations necessarily cripple the economy, when in fact they have no historical evidence to reach such a conclusion. Our position advocates that the U.S. should use its trade leverage to compel its trading partners to adopt sound labor standards. By trade leverage, we mean that the U.S. federal government will threaten to implement trade tariffs, also known as a tax on imported goods, and subsidies, or giving U.S.-based companies that produce goods that would otherwise be imported tax breaks. Trade threats such as these are effective in changing the behavior of our trading partners. By sound labor standards, we advocate a plan that includes a global minimum wage, universal standards for worker safety, and protection against employment discrimination. There are two key advantages to the plan. Firstly, we contend that illegal immigration is bad and leads to human trafficking, worker exploitation, and destroys the social safety net. By implementing our plan, the root causes for illegal immigration will be eliminated. We will reduce the appeal of illegal immigration to the U.S. by raising labor standards and the quality of life in other countries. You may remember the recent story of 19 people perishing as a result of a botched attempt at human smuggling. Even more horrific are the stories of young women and girls being tricked into sexual slavery. The Coalition Against Trafficking Women reports that women trafficked into the U.S. have been forced to have sex with 400 to 500 men to pay off $40,000 in debt for their passage. Exploitation through illegal immigration is also extremely prevalent in American society. Migrant farmers often fall victim to greedy landlords who manipulate the system to avoid their legal responsibilities in the areas of minimum wage and worker safety. These workers have no recourse, for they know that they risk being jailed or deported if they ever dare to complain. According to a recent study at Idaho State University, undocumented Mexican workers earn on average $4.94 per hour. This is less than the current $5.15 minimum wage in Idaho and 3 times lower than that of all other workers in Idaho. Finally, illegal immigration strains the social safety net in America. Illegal immigrants have put enormous strain on America's health and education systems. The Center for Immigration Studies reports that immigrants in 1992 produced a net national deficit of $29.1 billion, borne mainly by California and 6 other states. The center compared the cost of social services and education against taxes paid by immigrants to come up with the deficit. Emergency rooms in California are overwhelmed with illegal aliens. These hospitals are close to bankruptcy due to their service to the uninsured and illegal. School systems are faced with overcrowding and underfunding due to their legal responsibilities to serve illegal immigrants and their children. Our plan alleviates this by effectively raising the standard of living in other countries and thus decreasing the incentive for illegal immigration. The second major advantage to our plan is that it allows capitalist growth but regulates the access inherent in globalization. The plan is an effective way to iron out the problems inherent within the capitalist system. Government interaction is necessary to regulate the rich-poor gap that exists on a global level. There are several reasons as to why this holds true. The extreme rich-poor gap causes political conflict and ultimately leads to revolution. Individuals are rational, and when they feel as though they have no other option, they act in revolt of the system. Well-regulated capitalism, however, has the promise of sustaining economic growth and stability while hedging against the exploitation that occurs when checks are absent from the system. Our position represents a middle ground between the unfettered capitalism system advocated by my opponents and the overregulation that they will undoubtedly accuse us of. Gandhi once said, "Poverty is the worst form of violence." But what is poverty? To many of us here in the U.S., poverty means not owning an iPod. In reality, however, the UN estimates that there are over 1 billion people in the world living on less than $1 per day. According to the World Bank, the cost of one iPod could feed approximately 900 children for a day. The impacts of poverty are severe. Not only is it the leading killer in the world, it causes suffering through the spread of disease and famine. The UN estimates that every year over 11 million children die from preventable diseases that have been eradicated in most other parts of the world. 6 million children under the age of 5 die each year from hunger and famine. In fact, every 3.5 seconds, another person, most likely a young child, dies of hunger somewhere in the world. The negative would have you believe that unfettered capitalism works and that the market solves. Call me crazy, but given just the course of this debate, 943 people will have died from hunger doesn't convince me that the current system is solving. The UN has established 8 specific goals to be achieved by the year 2015. The goals were established and agreed to by all of the countries in the world. The goals are eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality and empower women, reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, ensure environmental sustainability, and develop a global partnership for development. These UN Millennium Development Goals specifically advocate economic reforms that work to alleviate the plight of the poverty-stricken. By implementing the plan, the U.S. would be taking a significant step towards implementing the MDGs and standing up as a leader for human rights and fair labor standards. The global economy is thoroughly dependent on the U.S. as a market. Trading partners rely on the consumption of U.S. citizens and businesses to maintain their demand in their home countries. In a speech at the Institute for International Economics, Harvard professor Lauren J. Summers said, "The U.S. has enjoyed a period of import-led growth, which has enabled others to enjoy export-led growth. This places the U.S. in a strategically powerful situation." In 1981, the trade threat strategy worked with Japan. The U.S. was suffering from a second round of OPEC oil shocks, and consumer demand was shifting away from U.S.-made cars and towards more fuel-efficient Japanese-made automobiles. Several U.S. companies nearly went bankrupt, and as a result of pressure from the U.S., as well as the threat of import quotas, Japan entered into a voluntary export restraint agreement with the United States. The agreement lasted for several years and was extremely effective in protecting U.S. interests. China is a more recent example of the efficacy of U.S. trade threats. For the past several years, China has pegged their currency, the yuan, to the U.S. dollar. They've done this in order to keep their currency devalued and thus make their products more attractive to U.S. imports, hungry for cheap manufactured goods. Many U.S.-based companies felt they were being unfairly treated and that the devalued yuan served as a barrier to entry in the market. The U.S. legislators then threatened to punish China with trade sanctions if they did not agree to begin letting their currency float to its appropriate valuation. The threat resulted in China agreeing to a managed float of the yuan. By leaning upon trading partners to implement a global minimum wage, universal worker safety standards, and the formulation of unions, the U.S. can become a leader in the advancement of human rights. The plan is an effective way to change the course of direction the globalized economy is taking. Instead of increasing the rich-poor gap, we have an opportunity to alleviate world hunger and disease. The negative will claim that our plan is fanciful and unrealistic. The fact of the matter is, however, even if all these reforms are 100% successful 100% of the time, they'll still be superior to the status quo in which billions of people are exploited, tortured, and starved to death. It is our responsibility to take action against the current injustices of the system.
With the import tariffs and domestic subsidies that you advocate, it would be more profitable for the United States and U.S. businesses to cynically argue that other countries haven't met the deal. Doesn't the AFT plan create a perverse incentive for the United States not to enforce better labor standards?
I would say that the U.S. has an incentive to report compliance truthfully because it has an interest in seeing workers' rights implemented internationally. If we were able to raise labor standards in other countries, it would solve the problem of illegal immigration. And this would be much more beneficial to the economy than any short-term U.S. boost we would see from that situation.
All right, and you say, quote, "Capitalism is based on the premise that competition is necessary for market forces to work properly," unquote. Your plan takes away these market forces and enacts legislation to actually lessen competition. So are you advocating a non-capitalist economy?
Not at all. Remember that our plan advocates a threat strategy. The reforms wouldn't necessarily have to be implemented.
So you wouldn't implement the threats?
The plan is to threaten to do so. Also keep in mind that if the trade sanctions do go into effect, they would act as modifiers within the capitalist system. It's not an overthrown capitalism. It's a modified system, which is actually what we currently have in the United States.
All right, so you maintain that labor standards are the root cause of immigration?
Not entirely. Income disparity and poor qualities of life are the root cause of illegal immigration.
All right. Okay, So are you arguing that no one in America is truly poor because, quote, to most of us in the U.S., poverty means not owning an iPod?
Not at all. I was merely using the iPod as an example of how most of us, myself included, are sheltered from the real poverty that exists globally.
So, but should we care about poverty in other countries more than we care about poverty in our own?
I believe that it's essential to look at the severity of poverty that exists. Here, we do have poverty, but not the extreme levels that we see on more of a global stage.
Amanda, do you own an iPod, or excuse me, a Dell MP3 player, which is very similar to an iPod?
Well, yes, my friend Becca, I do.
Well, okay, then why did you choose to buy this iPod, knowing, as you do, that this money could have been used to feed 900 children?
Although I do donate to international global relief programs, this is not the issue of the debate, whether or not you should forfeit your iPod and find a way to feed 900 starving kids. Alleviating poverty, as outlined by the UN Millennium Development Goals, requires an overhaul of the current system and thus the implementation of our plan. Simply, there's no organization that you can donate your iPod to.
Okay, well, my point was that people want these iPods and will buy these iPods even with protectionist barriers. So you give an example of a trade deal with Japan, which says which you say shows that a trade threat strategy works. But what did we threaten Japan with?
The United States threatened Japan with similar trade sanctions as what we are advocating in our plan.
All right, so given the dismal state of the U.S. auto manufacturers, how would you say this kind of trade deal with Japan ended up affecting our auto manufacturers?
Well, for all practical purposes, during that time, the trade sanctions threat achieved its goal. Japan reduced the number of exports to the U.S. and saved many U.S. manufacturers from bankruptcy. For reasons beyond the scope of this debate, the U.S. car manufacturers are in dire straits now, such as oil shocks, etc.